Most people quit investing right before the machine becomes worth owning. That is the truth. Nobody tells you in the beginning. They talk to you about discipline. They talk to you about consistency. They talk to you about budgeting and long-term thinking and patience and retirement and all the other respectable words that sound good in personal finance books. What they usually do not tell you is that the first phase feels insulting. You work. You save, you contribute, you sacrifice, and when you check the account, it still looks small enough to mock you. That is where most people lose the plot. They assume the system is not working. Because the visible reward is still tiny, they think the market is slow, or they are late, or the amount they can invest is too small to matter. Or other people were simply born with a better runway, so they stop, or worse. They keep going with a dead spirit, treating wealth building like one long, joyless tax on the present. I do not want that to be you. I want to give you a different picture. Think of wealth as an engine, not a pile, not a scoreboard, an engine. In the beginning, you are not driving it, you are building it. That is why the early years feel so unfair. An unfinished engine does not reward the builder with speed. It rewards him with noise, friction, and little hints of future power. If you judge the engine by how fast the unfinished thing moves across the road, you will conclude it is broken. If you understand what stage of assembly you are in, you will keep going long enough to watch the machine change character. That is the mother line of this entire story. There are 3 moments when the wealth engine changes character so dramatically that your relationship to money begins to shift with it. Not because magic appears, because mathematics finally becomes visible. These are not motivational milestones. They are structural thresholds. Before them, you are pulling most of the weight. After them, the engine begins pulling some of the weight for you. Much later, if you stay in the game long enough, the engine can pull more than your own labor does. That is the thing most people need to understand. Wealth is not linear. It has ignition points. I have spent enough time around money to know that people talk about net worth milestones in the wrong way. They make them sound like trophies. Hit 10,000, hit 100,000, hit a million. Put the screenshot online. Feel superior. That is childish. A milestone matters only if you understand what new physics begins there. That is what I want to explain. The first threshold is 10,000. The second is 100,000. The third is 1 million. You can argue over the exact figures in different currencies and different eras if you want. I am not interested in pedantic arguments. I am interested in the broad mechanics. The exact number may drift with inflation, market conditions, and your local reality. The structure does not. Let us begin with the first threshold, $10,000, pounds, euros, whatever your operating currency may be. Most people think of 10,000 as a small number in the investing world. That is one reason it matters, because its real power is psychological long before it becomes mathematical. This is the first mechanism. I call it the ignition threshold. An engine is not judged by the first twitch of the key. It is judged by whether it catches. 10,000 is where a great many people first feel that their financial life is no longer just wages coming in and bills going out. They have capital, small capital, perhaps embarrassingly small to a person who measures himself against millionaires online. But capital nonetheless. The account is no longer a toy, no longer a gesture, no longer a symbolic habit. It is a live machine. That matters more than almost anyone admits, because the early years of wealth building are not defeated by arithmetic. They are defeated by humiliation. I want to be plain about that. When you save 50 a month or 200 or even 500 in some cases, the chart is not flattering at first. Your own contributions dominate everything. If you invest 50 a month for 3 years and earn a reasonable return, nearly all the progress came from your hand, not the market's hand. That is what makes the beginning feel so thankless. The engine is technically on, but you are still the one pushing it down the road. This is why the ignition threshold matters. It proves something deeply important. It proves you can feed the machine long enough to keep it alive. Most people never do that. They start, stop, start again, stop again, spend the money, second guess the method, move things around, or talk themselves into waiting for a better time. 10,000 is not merely a number. It is evidence. It says you can create capital instead of merely consuming income. That is an identity shift. You move from earner to builder. That shift is worth more than the headline number because identity drives consistency. A person who sees himself as someone building capital behaves differently from someone who feels he is occasionally trying to be good with money. The first person has an engine. The second person has a mood. Now, mathematically, 10,000 is still not impressive in the way people want impressive things to be. Let us not pretend otherwise if you stop contributing at 10,000 and just let the account sit there compounding at a healthy long-term rate. Yes, over enough years it can become materially larger. It can become 40,000, 50,000, something helpful. But not life, changing in the dramatic sense most people fantasize about. This is exactly why the threshold is so dangerous. It gives you enough proof to feel something and not enough reward to feel fully justified. That gap is where people quit. They say, I have been doing this for years and I still don't have real money. That sentence has ruined more futures than bad stock picking ever did. Because what the person is really saying is, I wanted the engine to act finished while it was still being assembled. That is why the first threshold is a test of belief more than a test of math. And now I want to say something important about pensions and employer matches, because this is where ordinary people can shorten the road dramatically if they are willing to stop overlooking free fuel. If your employer contributes to a retirement plan, if tax relief turns 80 into 100, if matching contributions double part of what you put in, then you are not merely investing. You are increasing the fuel efficiency of the engine. Many people ignore this because it feels slow, invisible, and adult in the boring sense. That is exactly why it is so valuable. Boring acceleration is still acceleration. I have never understood why people refuse free compounding and then wonder why the road feels longer. Now let us move to the second threshold, 100,000. This is where the character of the engine changes in a way even skeptical people can finally feel. I call this the flywheel threshold. A flywheel is different from a machine that needs constant force. Once a flywheel reaches enough mass and speed, it stores momentum. It keeps helping even when your hand is not on it every second. That is what 100,000 begins to feel like. Before this point, your contributions still dominate the emotional experience of growth. After it, returns begin showing up large enough that they no longer look ornamental. This is the part where money starts making enough money that you can no longer honestly pretend the account is passive scenery. That is a major shift. If you have 100,000 invested and you earn a healthy long-term return, the annual movement can start looking like real salary fragments. Not enough to retire on, not enough to disappear into a life of ease, but enough to alter how you experience the relationship between labor and capital. You begin seeing months where growth is larger than what younger you thought was a good side hustle. You begin seeing years where the account adds a chunk of value you did not produce with your own direct effort. That is a strange and important moment. It is the first time many people feel what I call earned detachment from labor. I do not mean laziness. I do not mean fantasy retirement. I mean this, once the flywheel threshold is reached, in your bones, that your future wealth no longer depends solely on the next hour you personally work. It still depends on your effort, your saving, your discipline, your judgment, yes, but it is no longer chained entirely to your immediate labor. A second engine has begun operating. That changes how you walk through life. This is why the 100,000 threshold is where people begin talking about coast-fire and similar ideas. They start running the math and realizing that if they stopped contributing entirely, the machine would still become something meaningful decades later. Not because they become geniuses, because time plus a functioning flywheel is a serious force. Leave 100,000 alone long enough and it can become 1,000,000. Leave it even longer and it becomes more. That is not motivational fluff. That is the brutal, patient force of compounding. Now, do I recommend that everyone stop at 100,000 and coast? Of course not. That would be treating the threshold like a finish line instead of what it really is. A proof of power. The point is not to stop. The point is to understand the new physics. Once the flywheel threshold is reached, every additional contribution is no longer merely a drop in a bucket. It is fuel added to a machine already in motion. That should affect your motivation profoundly before 100,000. Missing contributions can feel small because everything feels small. After 100,000, missed contributions become more expensive in your imagination because you now understand what the machine can do when fed properly. This is where I want to force another identity shift. At 10,000, you become a builder. At 100,000, you become an operator. That difference matters. A builder is still proving that the machine can exist. An operator is now responsible for how efficiently it runs. Operating the machine well means understanding time, taxes, asset allocation, fees, and behavior. It means not touching the flywheel every time the market wobbles. It means understanding that volatility is not the enemy if the machine is still fundamentally sound. It means avoiding the temptation to interrupt compounding because life feels emotionally expensive this quarter. It means respecting the difference between wanting a lifestyle upgrade and wanting financial gravity to work on your behalf for decades. That is why the flywheel threshold separates people so sharply. Some reach it and become calmer, more strategic, more patient. Others reach it and get greedy, theatrical, or reckless because the first taste of momentum makes them believe they understand everything. They do not. In fact, the most dangerous thing about 100,000 is that it is large enough to flatter your ego and still small enough to be destroyed by stupidity. That is why I keep emphasizing operating system over emotion. A proper wealth operating system does not change its principles just because the numbers have become more satisfying to look at. Diversification still matters. Tax structure still matters. Fees still matter. Sequence still matters. The machine grows, but the laws do not become looser. In some ways, they become stricter because now mistakes cost more in opportunity terms. Let me show you what I mean. If a person reaches 100,000 by 35 and then leaves it to compound at a healthy long-run rate, yes, he can cross 1 million around retirement age. That is extraordinary. But what if instead of stopping, he continues contributing even modestly? Then the engine behaves in a completely different way. The journey to 200,000 speeds up, then to 300, then to 5. Each 100,000 arrives faster than the last if the system remains fed and undisturbed. That is the visual proof that the flywheel is not a metaphor, but a real mechanical change in your financial life. This is where ordinary discipline starts receiving extraordinary help from time. Now we arrive at the third threshold, 1 million. This is the number people romanticize most and understand least. They think 1 million is about status. It is not. They think 1 million is about feeling rich. Often it is not. They think 1 million is the point where all anxiety dissolves and life becomes permanently elegant. That is fantasy. What 1 million really represents is something far more important. It is the autonomy threshold. This is the third mechanism. I call it the autonomy threshold because at roughly this scale, depending on your life location and spending structure, your portfolio can begin doing something that changes the negotiation between you and work forever. It may not mean never working again. It may not mean yachts or villas or a life anyone would call luxurious. But it can mean that the machine is now producing enough annual motion that labor is no longer the unquestioned ruler of your time. That is what matters. At a healthy long-run return, $1 million portfolio throws off movement that can exceed many people as annual salaries. And even if you apply a conservative withdrawal discipline, you are suddenly in a different world. 4% of 1 million is 40,000. That is not extravagance in many places. It is, however, a very meaningful amount of life support. It is enough to change the tone of every decision you make, enough to walk away from certain humiliations, enough to negotiate differently, enough to switch careers, enough to take a sabbatical, enough to say no. And refusal power is one of the greatest luxuries wealth can buy. This is where the million threshold becomes more than a chart. It becomes a life architecture event. The person below it may still have impressive wealth, strong momentum, and a serious machine. But the person above it enters a territory where work begins to shift from necessity toward choice, or at least toward less coerced necessity. That difference affects the whole soul. You sleep differently when your portfolio can cover a meaningful share of your life. You negotiate differently. You tolerate less nonsense. You stop clinging to every unpleasant obligation because the edge of the cliff is no longer directly under your feet. That is why I say 1 million is the autonomy threshold. Not because it is a magic kingdom, because it is the point where the wealth engine becomes large enough to alter the terms of your existence. Now, I want to be very careful because there are two traps here. The first is pretending that 1 million means the same thing for everyone. It does not. 1 million in a high-cost city while supporting a family is one reality. 1 million with low expenses in a simpler setting is another. 1 million in tax-efficient structures is one thing. 1 million trapped in inefficient wrappers with high spending and bad habits is another. Numbers never live alone. They live inside behavior. The second trap is thinking 1 million means the work is over. It does not. The engine is powerful. Now, yes, but engines still require stewardship. Withdraw too aggressively, and you wound the system inflate your lifestyle too quickly, and you turn autonomy back into obligation. Dress better. Let inflation erode your thinking. Let taxes get ignored. Let concentration risk grow. Let spending become entitled. And the million becomes more fragile than the screenshot culture around it ever admits. That is why I say the autonomy threshold is where maturity matters most. At 10,000, discipline matters. At 100,000, operating skill matters. At 1 million, character matters. Because now the machine can genuinely change your life. And if your character has not grown alongside your capital, you will use that power badly. Now I want to step back and show you the whole arc, because this is where people finally understand why building wealth feels so uneven. In the first stage, from 0 to 10,000, the engine is being assembled. Your contributions do almost everything. The green line of growth is thin. Progress looks stubbornly self-made, because it is. This is why the early years feel like labor wearing a financial costume. In the second stage, from 10,000 to 100,000, the engine begins proving itself. The growth still does not dominate, but it starts to matter. Compounding is no longer theoretical. The account begins behaving like a live system. In the third stage, after 100,000, and especially as you move toward 1 million, the flywheel begins carrying real weight. Returns become visible enough to feel separate from your labor. Time becomes more obviously valuable than intensity. The machine is now doing a meaningful share of the work. In the fourth stage, once the autonomy threshold is reached, the machine can begin protecting your time, not merely enlarging your balance. That is the stage where money starts buying freedom rather than just future hope. That is the whole arc. And if you understand that arc, the beginning stops feeling like punishment. It starts feeling like assembly. That shift in interpretation may save your financial life, because the reason so many people quit is not that they lack intelligence. It is that they misread what phase they are in. They think slow visible growth means failure. It does not. It means the engine is not finished yet. This is why I tell people the most expensive sentence in wealth building is, it's not really doing anything. If you are contributing consistently, if you are inside sensible vehicles, if you are letting time work, then yes, something is happening. It may not be entertaining, it may not be socially impressive, but the machine is being built. To stop just because the early stages are unattractive is like tearing apart an aircraft because it doesn't fly while the wings are still on the workshop floor. Now let me speak directly to the person who feels behind. Maybe you did not start at 22, maybe you do not have 500 a month, maybe you cannot imagine 100,000, let alone 1 million. I understand that feeling. But here is what I know. The engine does not care about your shame. It cares about fuel and time. If your starting point is smaller, then begin smaller. If your timeline is later, then use the later years wisely. If your income is tight, then respect every structural advantage you can capture. Employer matching, tax efficiency, automatic contributions, frictionless investing, expense control, avoidance of stupid debt, and the discipline to keep the machine fed even when the first visible rewards are insulting. Because the truth is, most people are not defeated by low starting capital. They are defeated by broken motivation. That is why these thresholds matter so much. They give you a map. 10,000 is not only 10,000, it is proof that the engine exists. 100,000 is not only 100,000, it is proof that the engine can store force. 1 million is not only 1 million. It is proof that the engine can now materially alter the terms of your life. Those are not vanity numbers. They are changes in the physics of your future. Now I want to give you one final identity shift because it is the one that will keep you going when everything else feels too slow. Stop calling yourself an investor only when the numbers become large enough to impress other people. Call yourself an engineer of the wealth engine. An engineer respects boring things, routine fuel, friction reduction, compounding, tax design, automatic contributions. Time an engineer does not need applause every month. He needs the machine to keep improving. That is the mindset that survives the slow years. And the slow years are where almost every fortune is truly won. Not because the balances are huge, because the person who endured them now owns a machine most people abandoned before it had any chance to show its real character. So I will leave you with this. The first threshold teaches you that you can build capital. The second teaches you that capital can build on itself. The third teaches you that capital can begin buying back your life. Miss the meaning of those thresholds, and they become just numbers. Understand them properly, and they become one long argument for staying in the game long after everyone around you has decided the early stages were too slow to matter. That is the mathematics. That is the psychology. And that is why, if you are still in the beginning and wondering whether the machine is really doing anything, my answer is simple. Yes, but you are still building the engine. Do not judge it by the speed of the unfinished thing. Judge it by what happens once it finally catches.